Well, I got to tell you, of all the topics that we deal with on the Dove TV and the Dove Radio, the one that gets the most response is anything that has to do with Christian apologetics. And I am really honored to have with us today Rice Broocks. He is the author of a new book. I have it here in my hand, God's Not Dead. There's a picture of it there on the screen, Evidence for God in an Age of Uncertainty. And let me encourage you to check it out. It is put out by Thomas Nelson. You may want to see if Evangel has it, or Discount Christian Books, or Barnes & Noble, or online at Amazon.com. Rice is also the senior minister of Bethel World Outreach Church in Nashville. He's a co-founder of Every Nation, a family of churches which currently has about 1,000 people involved in more than 60 different nations. So, hey, Rice, nice to have you today. How you doing, my friend?
Very good, very good. Thank you for having me, Perry.
Yeah, like I said, of all the things we do with our programming on radio and television, I got to tell you, apologetics gets the most interest. And so thank you for your book. What led you to take it on so head on like you did?
Well, we've got some guys in our church called the Newsboys, and they produced a song called God's Not Dead, and it got an immediate response, like you're talking about how the interest in apologetics among your listeners. Well, I think what they did was they gave young people this anthem for faith, just like the John Lennon Imagine song is kind of an anthem for unbelief. And they just had this groundswell, and when they'd go into concerts, people were just going crazy saying, God's not dead. And so they came to me and said, would you write the book that kind of gives more of the specifics so that these young people primarily can have specific answers to give people when they say God's not dead? So I've worked in apologetics for years. I work on the college campus, so it was an easy thing in terms of a desire, from a desire point of view. Wasn't quite as simple in terms of writing the book.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
That was a different story. That's like saying, hey, I think I'm going to go on a walk across America. But it was a great journey for me to write this book.
Is skepticism on the rise in this country?
You know, Perry, it is, and it's kind of it's like I think, to quote the famous philosopher Forrest Gump, both skepticism and faith it's happening at the same time. You have a rise of skepticism, and you have a rise of faith. It's like, you know, gross darkness in Isaiah will cover the earth, but great light will shine. Wheat in the tares. And I think it's because of these voices of skepticism. You know, when you start wondering, where did all of this, like in the parable of the wheat and the tares, where did all these tares come from? Well, somebody sowed the seed. I went down, when I was writing this book, I went to Melbourne, Australia, to the Global Atheist Convention. I'd read a lot from Richard Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris and these personalities in the atheistic world. And so they were down there having this big convention. So I went down to just kind of hear what they had to say firsthand. And what was interesting, Perry, was you'd think if 3,500 atheists were gathering from around the world on a Friday night, all day Saturday, and then they broke Sunday. So it was a pretty limited time.
Right.
The opening Friday night session, the four speakers were four professional comedians.
What?
Four professional comedians. And basically what it was mockery, insult, ridicule, etc. And the ultimate irony was that the subtitle was A Global Celebration of Reason. And I tell people there was very little reason present in the global celebration of reason. But their tactic is pretty much insult. If they can take out a believer with just a spiritual version of a drive-by shooting, your God's a fairy tale, the Bible's a book of fairy tales, there's no proof for God. So they just throw out these confident assertions that they don't really have to back up. If they say it with enough energy, people say, well, maybe that's true, and they kind of let go of their faith.
You know, what's so interesting, we're seeing more and more talk about God than ever. I mean, let's talk about, first of all, the Bible series that's going on in television right now, getting huge ratings, 13.1 million. We're watching, the resignation of one pope and the installation of another. It seems that the issue of faith, the issue of God, is all over the news right now, but that's about all it does. It doesn't seem to penetrate below that.
Yeah, don't forget the God particle.
Oh yeah, that's right. That was a good one too. Yeah, right.
Yeah. God particle, which is a misnomer, because actually the man who came out with the term the God particle actually meant it to be we got a family-friendly audience, but he was going to use the Lord's name in vain, a God blank particle
Right.
because they couldn't find the particle. And if they didn't find the particle, then everything they believed about physics in the standard model would have been completely wrong. So it's this mistaken notion that somehow there's this godlike particle, and it's an important particle in physics, but it's certainly not some magical particle that is going to be a God substitute. But you're right, and that's because the majority of the planet, Perry, believes in God, and as much as atheism tries to say that it's not important or it will vanish, the more science advances, the more somehow religion becomes less relevant. The opposite is actually true. In fact, the editor of The Economist magazine did an obituary for God in the 90s, and he came out just a few years ago with a retraction and wrote the book, God is Back, chronicling the rise of faith around the world. I mean, Africa was 8% Christian in 1900. It's almost 50% today.
Right.
I sat in New York City, where I get to work a lot, and a man named Tony Carnes, who chronicles religion in the city, he said there was, in 1980, there were 8 or 9 evangelical churches in 1980. Today in Manhattan, there's over 200, and they're very, very strong. In other words, 9 what he called fairly weak churches in 1980, now 200. That leads him to call New York, or Manhattan rather, the post-secular city. So when you have journalists calling a city post-secular, that's quite a flip of the script, if you will.
Yeah. Rice, so where do you start your argument, God's not dead? How do you start it?
I started with reason itself. One of the main chapters is called Real Faith Isn't Blind. And that's, again, one of the insults, that somehow all we have is blind faith. Has no evidence in the natural world, no evidence in history, no evidence in science. And really, it's just the opposite. Real faith, our faith, is not blind. It's based upon the evidence, first of all, of creation. Because the scripture talks about that God has given enough witness of himself in what he has made so that people don't have an excuse. So whether it's the external world, the stellar universe, or the cells, the complexity in DNA, which has led many, atheists to be now former atheists, because it's just too much. It would be like if you got a pocket text, Perry. I pick up my phone here for a little. If you got a text from somebody and it just was, you could tell they sat on it. We call it a pocket text. Well, if you get a text, if a kid gets a text that says, "Don't tell anybody I cheated on the test," you would know that they did not construct that accidentally. Well, what if you got a text 3.1 billion letters long? That's the information ordered and sequenced in human DNA. And that's just led people to just come to the screeching halt in their skepticism, to say there's no way that could have happened by accident.
We're seeing more and more evidence on creation versus evolution, and supporting creation than evolution. Books coming out like Rocks Don't Lie and other things. Is that part of your argument as well?
Well, what I try to do, Perry, is, so many times, especially in the campus where I work, people get bogged down in issues of age of the earth and interpretations of Genesis. My thesis is plain: God's not dead, that he is real. Just like in Hebrews, when it says, he who comes to God must believe he exists, and that he rewards those that seek him. So ground zero is just acknowledging the existence of God. So really, rather than kind of stepping into areas that end up just getting people arguing, not that. Can you prove that, though,
in your argument? Can you prove the existence of God? If so, how do you do that?
Well, I believe that it depends on what level of proof you're asking for. I believe there is overwhelming evidence for God. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what are you looking for when you're looking for evidence for God? You're not looking for a particle or an element or a rock. You're looking for the presence, the existence of an unseen intelligence that is responsible for everything.
Right.
And so if you go into a laboratory and you're trying to set up an apparatus to test for God, you're really not looking for God in the test tube. You're looking for the presence of, let's say, the scientist, so to speak, or the intelligence that comes into an environment, arranges it in such a way that a logical conclusion can be made. So the presence of intelligence, whether it's from the very beginning of the universe to the beginning of life, to the existence of consciousness, and then, Perry, the ultimate, as we approach Easter, the ultimate evidence, the ultimate proof that God gave was in becoming a man in Jesus Christ and living among us. I mean, you're talking about the ultimate science experiment. God becomes man and allows himself to be handled, tested, and his resurrection verified conclusively that he was who he said he was, the Son of God.
Let me just again remind our listeners and viewers, God's Not Dead, picture of the book there on the screen. It is put out by Thomas Nelson. Check it out at Evangel or Christian Discount Books in Jacksonville. Evidence for God in an Age of Uncertainty. So put out by Rice Broocks. He's the author that we're talking to today. I just did an interview a little while ago, and the statistic that was so alarming to me was 3 out of 10 children that leave church will stay with their faith through college. That's a 70% loss. What do you say to college students that are struggling with their faith or maybe dealing with the existence of God?
Perry, yeah, that's a pretty reliable statistic. I think it starts like it is with my 13-year-old and 16-year-old. I think that we have to expose them to what they're going to hear. It's almost like if you're going to give somebody a vaccine, you give them enough of it so that when the real disease comes, they're going to be immune. And these arguments are easily defeated. I mean, the skeptical arguments are just, many of times they're absurd. I mean, I had a young person said to me, well, I got to philosophy class and they said, if God is all powerful, could he create a rock so big he couldn't move it? And he said, I didn't know the answer, so I just backslid. And I said, I don't think you had far to slide if that's what it took. And the answer is simple. Because God is all powerful, then there's nothing he can create that he cannot handle. That would violate the skeptical response is violating the law of what's called non-contradiction. So it's a logical absurdity, but it doesn't matter. So if a young person isn't prepared, then when they hear these arguments, when they hear the Bible's a book of fairy tales. Well, look, if you open up a book of fairy tales, it starts with once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away. It's a far cry for how the Bible begins, rooted in history, so that the places and the people in the Bible are historically reliable. They actually, Jesus himself lived. And for somebody that doesn't understand that, even some of the worst critics or the most vocal critics of the Christian faith, like Bart Ehrman, have written books acknowledging Jesus existed. So the key is that we got to start early. I mean, youth groups with smoke and mirrors. I mean, you can have a youth group that's cooking. They got a tap dancing duck that quotes and quacks scriptures. I mean, we got the best and the brightest and the coolest. But when that culture of youth group is now gone and they're in another culture on a secular campus, they've got to have more than just a cool experience of Jesus. They have to have some substance, and that's what I hope this book will help them have.
Well, excellent. I'm going to get you back. Thank you, Rice. I know you're tight. Thanks so much. Again, the book is entitled God's Not Dead. Check it out by Rice Broocks. Again, put out by Thomas Nelson. Thank you, my friend. Blessings to you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.